welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. It's great to see so many people signed up. My name is Rihanna Wilshire. I'm a director at Freeths, having just joined the energy, waste and sustainability team there. Our team specialises in all types of clean energy projects, energy from waste projects, battery storage, electric vehicles. But today I'm going to talk to you about what I've been specialising in for the last 13 years, and that's district heating projects. Now I say district heating, but of course it covers district cooling and private wire electricity as well. But we're focusing on heat today. I'm joined by Vimal Barna, Director and Founder at JOULE Infrastructure, and also Stephen Knight, Director of the Heat Trust. This is the first of two parts, two webinars. This one's really going to give us an overview of what heat networks are and the risks, challenges and opportunities they create. And the second one will be about decarbonisation in March next year. We're also hoping early next year to have, if you're in London, to have a tour of one of the E.ON district heating networks and their CHP systems down in Smithfield in the CityGen site there. So we'll have further details about that probably in our next webinar in March. So if you could put the first slide over, please, Tom. Thanks. So this is what we're going to be looking at over the next hour. What is a heat network? What are its projects and drivers? Who's involved and why these? Why do we have them in the market? What are the contractual models and the regulation? I should say the lack of regulation, which has actually driven why we've got a number of different contractual modules in the market. What are its key considerations and challenges when putting a project together? I'll then hand over to Stephen, who will talk about the Heat Trust and its aims, and then he'll hand over to Vimal, who will talk about how to approach a project. I'll then wrap up with what to look out for in the future, what are the key trends and where's the market going, and then we'll open it up to a panel discussion. So as Tom said, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we'll pick them up at the end. So next slide, please, Tom. So what is a heat network? I'm sure many of you will be very, very familiar with them. It's essentially a single source of decentralized generation. Of course, if you've got bigger schemes, you'll have lots of different sources feeding in, but they generally tend to be a single source with a couple of substations to boost supply. They currently meet about 2% of the UK's demand for heat, but hopefully that's going to be going up to about 18% by 2050. So you have this single energy centre and a network of pipes that run under the ground and up through buildings, serving lots and lots of different buildings. You've got residential, municipal, commercial, and of course you don't necessarily have to have it just on a single development. It can be across neighbouring developments, and we're seeing particularly in London at the moment, large-scale networks where you've got lots of developments all connecting into one. So they really do range in size and purpose. They're really suited to sites which have a constant heat load, and particularly those which are near a heat source, particularly energy from waste and those types of projects. Those are the ones which really make them efficient and cost effective. The bigger they are, the better economies of scale you have. So particularly connecting lots of networks together, you can be getting better efficiencies, better savings and better carbon savings. So if you're taking a residential unit as an example, then the heat will be provided to them for space heating and hot water via a heat plate exchanger. So looking at the sources of heat then, they do range. The majority is combined heat and power, or CHP as it's more commonly known. This is cogeneration, so you take a single fuel source and turn it into both heat and electricity. And that heat is created through the generation of the electricity as a byproduct. It's then harnessed and pumped around to all the different users and customers. Mainly they are gas-fired, so methane-fired. CHP, biomass and biogas also exist, but they're slightly more tricky to include in a development, so there's fewer of them. And a gas-fired CHP heat network would normally give you about 85% efficiency. When you compare that to about 53% of a combi boiler in your own home, then once you factor in the generation of that heat, of that gas in the first place from the power station, then they are seen to be as an efficient solution. When you've got the creation of electricity alongside that, you also have the added benefit of what to do with that electricity. You can create private wire networks and sell that electricity to users on site, or you could use it for your own purposes or site, or you could sell it back to the grid, power purchase agreements with third parties. So the creation of heat alongside the electricity is seen as great for revenue generating. So unfortunately, as you will see as we go along today, gas-fired CHP is no longer as sexy as it used to be. It's not seen as a great carbon alternative. And so with the market is moving towards electrification and better use of heat pumps, particularly ground source and air source heat pumps, where you basically extract heat from the source, compress it to increase the temperature, and then pump that heat round. So this is in the bid to move towards electrification of heat networks and away from the use of fossil fuels like gas in heat networks. The benefit of them is they require less maintenance, but they also at the moment need the buildings that they're providing to be far more efficient, which is obviously a bit of a hurdle at the moment. So another heat source that we see is heat recovery. So whether that's from industrial processes or energy from waste or manufacturing processes, if there is any heat waste that's given off as part of that process, then it can be captured and either recycled back into that process, or it can be used via a heat network and supplied in exactly the same way to residential and commercial properties, wherever that might be. So again, you could take that heat and steam quite often and use it to generate electricity by putting it through a steam turbine to create both heat and electricity, or you could convert steam through cooling towers, for example, to create the hot water and pump it around that way. So there are so many different types of heat recovery out there. There really is a huge amount of opportunity. So I have the next slide, please. Project drivers and stakeholders. Now, as you'll see on the next slide, I'll come to in a moment, there are lots of different stakeholders involved in these types of projects. And why are heat networks popular, and why are they going to become more popular? And the key one at the moment is decarbonisation. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because we're going to have a second webinar on it. But at the moment, biomass and biogas projects are seen as basically carbon neutral, and recovered heat and heat pumps are the future and the best way of decarbonising the heat network. You could even throw hydrogen into that if it really takes off. So there is obviously a huge push at the moment by government to decarbonise all heat by 2050. And as I said earlier, 18% of that will probably come from heat networks. There's going to be it's already a big market, but it's going to grow because of this push towards decarbonisation. Planning and building regulations are often a key driver when it comes to putting heat networks in. Quite often, local planning authorities will either require a heat network to be installed, or connection into an existing heat network. And that comes through planning requirements and building regulations. And we'll come on to building regulations in a little bit, because Part L of the building regulations will be tightening in order to tighten those carbon standards through the future homes standards and the future buildings standards as well next year. And then it will be really ramping up in 2025. So obviously heat networks also provide an opportunity for revenue. It's not a huge amount of private investment in the moment, and I'll come on to the challenges of those in a minute. But also, if you already have an existing heat source, like an energy from waste plant, or a data center, for example, and you have heat available that you want to be able to recover and pump around, then a heat network is a really good way of capturing that. And security of supplies, many people, particularly manufacturers, want to be off-grid when it comes to getting their heating. If there's any issues with gas supplies or electricity supplies, for example, they want this backup generation. And so security of supply is another driver for people to put heat networks in. So obviously, every project's going to include a landowner, quite often a developer, whether that's commercial or residential. They all have their own drivers for them. There's going to be likely to be an energy service company, or an ESCO as they're called, which is basically in the heat world mini utility, and service providers who might just provide individual services like O&M, billing service, metering services. And another stakeholder is obviously going to be the customer. They're going to want some protection, and to not have high prices and make sure they get their security of supplies, etc. Funders at the moment are there aren't that many third-party funders, and the reason for that is there's quite a few challenges when it comes to funding. It's quite high upfront capital costs and long payback periods, which are putting private funding off unless they've got really large schemes which are near a fuel source or have a really decent heat demand in order to make the economies of scale work. So quite often this is quite difficult. You get a pinch between equity investors who want a return on their investment, but of course when your main revenue is customer charges, and you can't just go around charging people what you like, and so there is always going to be a natural cap against what you can charge people versus how much revenue you'll be able to take out, and balancing that against operational costs. So local authorities and planning authorities obviously are big stakeholders in these projects, because they all set the requirements. Quite often they might set the carbon targets, and they also local authorities quite often incentivize, and we've seen numbers of local authorities actually setting up their own schemes as a way of driving heat networks in their local area. Helps to inject funding where there's a funding gap as well. And quite a number of them are having to retrofit their own existing stock due to the heat metering and billing regulations. So there's also a need to tackle fuel poverty quite often as another driver for local authorities and registered providers in particular. So if we could just next slide, please. So here's a really, really simple contractual model of what the first model I wanted to talk to you about, which is what we term the ESCO model, Energy Services Company. And as I said, they act as a mini utility, and they really take over the operation of the network and all the risks associated with demand from customers not paying their bills, defects risks, and all the operational risks. And the idea is that landowners and developers are not in the business of providing heat networks, but a number of ESCOs are, and so they want to take that responsibility away from them, allow the developer to step back and put all the risk onto the ESCO, and they treat it as a long-term concession. So they're normally 25 to 40 years. And as you can see there, the main concession agreement will govern all of the rights and obligations of the ESCO and how it has to perform. It then enters into customer agreements with all of the tenants and customers across the site, so that doesn't have to be done by the landlord. And then it will then either in-house or outsource all of the operational sides, so the O&M, capital replacement, metering and billing, etc. And then we have back-to-back arrangements with the contractor that actually installed it in the first place. So the ESCO model really allows developers to take a step back and let someone else run the show. If you could, the next slide, please. So this is kind of the opposite end of the scale, outsourced services or facilities management, as FM as it's sometimes called. This is where we don't appoint an ESCO at all, but the developer or the landowner takes it upon themselves to operate it and will outsource that to a facilities operator. So you could get a one-stop shop with services agreements. So someone comes along and does all your O&M, your customer service and your metering and billing, or you could appoint individual service providers. But that what underpins it is actually the risk will sit with the landowner. So if there's a supply failure and it's outside of those services arrangements, and the cost will fall to the landowner. That's just one example. Again, the landowner would take the risk if the demand's not sufficient or if the prices aren't set highly enough. It'll have to plug any gap in costs and any shortfalls. So they're shorter term arrangements, anything for a couple of years up to 10, 15 years. And they're much more flexible than ESCO arrangements, which tend to be longer term. You don't have to grant land rights either. It's mainly just around providing them with access to do their services. Of course, I've given you the two contractual models, but there are a number of different hybrids that sit in between them and make them far more complicated than that, particularly where you've got kind of multi-ownership of a site, or you've got lots of developments connecting into a site, or you have connection arrangements as well. You might a developer might want a risk and revenue sharing arrangement, so you could put joint venture in place to accommodate that. So I've given you two there, but there really are many more than that. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm not going to talk about regulation in a lot of detail because I know that Stephen's going to be coming on to this, but I just wanted to make the point that heat and cooling is really not regulated very much at all in the UK, and that has driven the contractual models wanting to put lots of customer protection in, particularly around ESCOs and making sure that they look after their customers and bill them properly, etc. So the main regulation we've got in the UK is around heat networks and metering and billing, and making sure that anyone who supplies heat does it in a metered way. And so that's going to help drive efficiencies, fair billing, and increased visibility for users as well. Then when it comes to operating heat networks, we've got the CIBSE CP1 Heat Networks Code of Practice, and that's all about how operating standards, etc., and trying to create a standard across the industry. Private wire electricity is obviously very different because the supply, generation and distribution of electricity is licensed in the UK. So putting it as a comparison where you've got your electricity licensing regime, which is incredibly costly and onerous to follow, heat and cooling in comparison is incredibly light. But I'll let Stephen talk to you about that one. So next slide, please. So key considerations and challenges. This is just a kind of a smattering of a few of the things that we wanted to cover off and what you should think about when you're putting your project together. Vimal's going to cover some more of them in detail, but really you need to kind of think about, well, I'm looking to put a heat project together. How long do I want support with it? Do I want to have a long-term ESCO arrangement or a shorter facilities management arrangement? Am I looking to build out and flip to a third party or an investor in 5-10 years time, in which case do I want to split my land up? And that's going to make it very difficult through having a heat network because it's a connected site. So you want to make sure that you put heat connection arrangements in through your contracts in place at the outset, rather than trying to unpick it all when you want to come and sell. And believe me, I've worked on a number of projects where we're trying to sell and we've had to unpick it all. So it does happen, unfortunately. If you're a landlord as well, you want to make sure you've got customer protections in place, looking at Section 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act, and making sure you're procuring properly and consulting properly so that you don't fall foul of Section 20 to further down the line. You also think about the amount of risk you want to take on, whether that's in relation to operation, supply failures, demand risk, who's going to set your tariffs for you, whether you're willing to take all of that on in order to get the revenues, or whether you're willing to outsource that to an ESCO in order to get it off your plate, essentially. So next slide, please. It's Stephen. So I'll now hand over to Stephen.
Hello, hi, and good morning, everybody. And so I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm the Director of Heat Trust, which is the National Consumer Protection Scheme for heat networks. And I'm going to start off, thanks for the slide. Yes, so I'm going to start off just by giving you a little bit of general background around district heating and some of the history. So this slide has some of the long history around the world of district heating, and we can see the first recorded example of a district heating scheme was in the 14th century in France, where there was a geothermal source that somebody had the great idea to provide this hot water that was coming out of the ground to a number of buildings around the village, and for heating and hot water. So that was the first recorded example. But in practice, in the 19th century, there were some commercial district heating schemes implemented in the US. And in Europe, we've seen in the 20th century, in the 1920s, and in Germany, and particularly in the planned economies of the Soviet Union and China in the 30s and 50s, huge amounts of district heating developed. But around the world, major cities, you see some of them listed here, have quite significant district heating schemes. And some of these are on a very large scale, and some of them are smaller. but this is, as I say, a technology that's been around some while. We move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, right. So this gives you an idea of around the world the number of the amount of heat delivered by district heating schemes. You can see Russia and China are the two largest users of district heating still, and I'd say a lot of this was developed in the under the planned economy era. But you can see a fairly significant amount in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. And you can see on the right there, we can see in a number of countries in Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia, district heating is actually the major source of heating for homes. Move on to the next slide. So this slide gives you a little bit of background around district heating in the UK at the moment. So as we said earlier, I think it's around 2% of UK heat is supplied via some kind of heat network. And the data that we have, which isn't perfect, I have to say, but suggests that there are something like 14,000 heat networks around the UK, many of them very, very small individual buildings, and mostly in England. I'd say a big concentration in London. And we think that there are something like 500,000 consumers, and of those about 450,000 domestic consumers. The rest will be businesses at the moment on heat networks of one form or another. And of course, as was said earlier, the plan in order to tackle climate change is that we want to get that 2% up to nearer 20% over the course of the next few decades. So this is an industry which is likely to grow very dramatically over the coming years, and a technology which has great potential in terms of decarbonisation of heat and the move away from the ubiquitous gas boiler as a way of heating our homes. So move on to the next slide, which is all about what I really want to talk to you about, which is about consumer protection issues. Now, one of the things about district heating is that it is, by its very nature, really, because it's provided on a communal basis, it is a monopoly energy provider. So if you are a consumer on a district heating scheme or communal heating scheme, you do not have the choice to switch supplier for a cheaper one in the same way you can with a gas supplier. It's not as simple as that. So consumers are very much captive. And at the moment, it's also an industry which is not regulated, as was said earlier by Ofgem. So there's no price cap for consumers. There are no step-in arrangements if a supplier goes under. There's no minimum service standards mandated with guaranteed service payments or compensation payments for underperformance. And there's no mandated provision around protection of vulnerable customers in the same way you'd see in gas and electricity. And I'll sort of add to that list that there's no mandatory technical standards as well at the moment. There are voluntary technical standards, CP1 standards, but they are not mandatory. And so one of the key issues that we see in consumer protection terms is a lot of poorly performing heat networks out there at the moment haven't been well specified or designed or installed, and produce very poor outcomes for consumers. So a lot of reliability issues and poor heat issues. And the final thing is there's no mandatory alternative dispute resolution mechanism in place for heat. So unlike electricity and gas, consumers don't, by law, have access to the Energy Ombudsman. Now, all that should change in a few years' time, because the government have promised to regulate this sector, but it's probably 3 or 4 years away from happening, because we haven't yet seen primary legislation to introduce the powers to do this. So Heat Trust therefore exists. Can I move on to the next slide, please? So we were set up as a voluntary regulator in 2015 by a mixture of the industry and government, recognizing this gap. And essentially, we get energy suppliers to sign up to us, heat suppliers to sign up to us, and we provide the same sort of protections that consumers get in the gas and electricity industry. So we set guaranteed service standards through our scheme rules. with compensation payments based on the guaranteed service payments that Ofgem would provide in the through the gas and electricity regulations. We provide mandatory protection of vulnerable customers and priority service registers, and access to the Energy Ombudsman for dispute resolution. And on top of that, we audit and monitor our suppliers on a regular basis to make sure that they meet those standards. And at the moment, we have around 61,000 customers protected by our scheme on about 105 heat networks. Now, that is about 12% of customers that we know in the UK are on heat networks, so it is a fairly small proportion. Most of our members tend to be on fairly big district heat schemes, commercially run district heat schemes by ESCOs, but I think there's an awful lot of consumers out there who are not protected at the moment and are not subject to these kind of standards and consumer protections. But we're very keen to reach out to anyone who's supplying heat and bring you on board with our scheme to address those issues. And what I would say is that we work with those entities that have heat supply agreements with the customer. So the entity that registers with us can be the landlord if they have the heat supply agreement, or it can be an ESCO. It can be, we've got local authorities who are registered with us, not many, but we have some. We have housing associations on board with us. It can be anyone. But it's the entity that has the heat supply agreement with the end customer. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, and has been mentioned earlier, the future is regulation. And we very much support this because we think that consumer protection is something which needs to be with all consumers of heat. And I think as an industry, if we're going to go from 2% to 20%, then I think for consumer acceptance of this technology, then I think regulation is going to be a must, particularly given the monopoly situation that consumers find themselves in. So government has promised regulation of heat networks, including UK-wide consumer protection regulations. That promise or the commitment the government has is to introduce legislation this Parliament, i.e. before the 2024 general election. We hope it'll be actually introduced in the next parliamentary session, the 22-23 parliamentary session. That said, we, and I think the Bay civil servants, very much hoped it was going to be in the last Queen's speech for the 2021-22 session, and sadly it wasn't. So I wouldn't at the moment bet my house on it, but hopefully it will be introduced. We'll get an announcement in the Queen's speech in May that there will be legislation. But beyond that, of course, the meat of the regulations will come in secondary legislation, which will come after that legislation has gone through Parliament. And then Ofgem, who are nominated to become the regulator, will then have to translate those regulations into a regulatory regime and so on. So there is still some years to go before formal regulation protects all consumers. But it's on its way, and it will, as far as Bays have announced so far, it is very much going to follow the model that Heat Trust has established in terms of rules and regulations, and we certainly are working at the moment very closely with Ofgem in terms of helping them to learn about the heat network sector and prepare for their role as regulator, and that's a big focus for ourselves. Regulation, and I've focused mainly on consumer protection because that's what we're about, but regulation is also going to cover things like decarbonisation of heat networks, the need to do that. It's going to cover powers for heat network operators, so things like the rights to dig up the road and so on, which you don't currently have, as you're not a gas and electricity operators get those kind of powers. Those kind of powers will be available to heat network operators. Provider of last resort provisions, and critically price regulation, which I think is an area which, it's true to say, Ofgem and Bays are still struggling with how that will work, but there will be some regulation around pricing. At the moment, what I would say is we run as Heat Trust a tool, an online tool on our website, which gives heat network consumers the ability to benchmark the cost they're currently paying against what it might cost them if they had a more traditional gas boiler. And that I suppose is our nod to pricing. It provides, I think, some transparency and some kind of benchmarking, but as a voluntary scheme, we're not able to set rules around pricing because of competition law, and that would effectively set us out as a cartel. So we're not able to do that. But nevertheless, pricing is a big issue with consumers, as is reliability. And I think those are issues which I think regulation will have to cover. The other big issue, of course, is technical standards. And at the moment, I mentioned the CP1 technical standards, which have been developed on a voluntary basis. Something akin to those is likely to be enshrined in legislation by the legislation when it comes. And I think anyone who's thinking of developing a heat network now ought to be, in order to be ready, should ensure that they are CP1 compliant, and that their terms of conditions with consumers are compliant with Heat Trust rules. And indeed, I'd like to see them register with us so that we can provide the assurance that that is the case. Good, so we can move on to the next slide, which really is just saying, as I've said, I think in advance of these regulations becoming mandatory, the best way that suppliers and those running heat networks can make sure they're ready and protect their consumers and provide reassurance to consumers in the interim is by getting in touch with us and joining, registering their heat networks with the Heat Trust, and making sure that their consumers are properly protected and have those kind of protections. And I think also making sure that all your procedures and contracts are compliant with industry standards, and you're ready for those regulations and the regulatory regime when it becomes mandatory in a few years' time. So I think that's pretty much all I was going to say for now, but thank you very much, and I'll obviously try and answer as many questions as I can later on when we come to the Q&A session.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Rihanna. Hi, everyone. My name is Vimal. Great to be here today. I'm with JOULE Infrastructure. So if we skip to the next slide, please, Tom. Thank you. JOULE Infrastructure is a specialist consultancy. We help and support landowners and project sponsors in the development of decentralized energy infrastructure. We focus on helping establish and develop that strategic intent right up front to suit the landowner and their project requirements right at the very beginning. It's an absolutely critical step in the development of energy infrastructure, and we really support doing that as early as possible. But I'll get onto that in a minute. We support in the commercialization and financial structuring for the deployment of energy infrastructure. And then we can go out and support in the procurement and establishing a industry-leading or best-in-class supply chain to support that scheme and the way we've developed it. And post-operation or post-development and post-PC, we can assist with the asset management and ongoing operation, validation, and optimization on behalf of the project owner. Yeah, next slide, please, Tom. So it's a fairly brief presentation, and we'll be touching on, what are the things as a landowner, project sponsor, what are you being asked to do through planning and regulatory requirements now and in the future. It is important to look ahead as well, especially if you've got schemes that have extended build outs, as Rihanna and Stephen have touched on. If you've got a scheme that will be built out over the next 5 to 10 years, as many heat networks are, you will be crossing over a number of regulatory changes and new regulations that come in. So we need to have an eye looking ahead, very much so. And we need to make sure that we can account for that in the delivery. I'll just canter through what technology is being looked at and what isn't, and then we'll look at how these requirements and technology can work to your benefit, rather than just presenting a bottom line cost. And lastly, what are the right or what are the procurement and delivery contractual structures that can help realize these. Next slide, please, Tom. So, we've the two previous presentations have really touched on this, and I don't think I'll add much to it other than to say, we've got the zero carbon and energy efficiency and Part L targets to hit, and we all know about those coming up. You will be asked to either create or connect to independent heating networks, and as Rihanna mentioned, these include cooling and potentially power networks. You will be asked to look at co-located plant or any opportunities for sleeving or power purchase agreements in the neighboring vicinity. You will be asked to work with non-combustion plant and potentially in air quality management areas. So that's something to consider in your technology selection. And obviously, we are moving to a no gas future. And so these are the types of things you're being asked to do through regulation and planning. Next slide, please. So the types of technologies that are being used, we've got passive insulation and recovery technologies, and although we're talking about heat networks in this presentation, I think it's really important to keep sight of the passive and low-hanging fruit that we can hit. The other technologies are reciprocating and turbine cogeneration plant. Obviously, gas CHP is not the flavor of the month at the moment, but heat pumps are. Air and ground source, and particularly those for residential end users. Car charging infrastructure is going to be ever increasing, and looking to manage your demand control on that, just to help mitigate your electrical grid reinforcement and point of connection charges. The embedded generation and on-site storage, so things like battery fall into that category. And then we will start looking at ever increasingly microgrid and demand side reduction. So all of that on the power side. But I think the main takeaway from this slide is that there's a palette of technologies that you could look to use. And right now the discussion is heavily biased towards heat pumps, and they are a good technology and they're a robust technology. It's fair to say potentially we don't have enough operational data on that, and the supply chain needs to catch up. But these things will develop as the demand increases. I think the only takeaway is I would always recommend looking at a suite of technologies rather than focusing on one, and making sure the technology you're looking at is best suited for the end use of that scheme. So we're not just selecting the technology up front because everybody's talking about it, and then we dive straight in. I think we need to really evaluate technologies and heat sources on a level playing field before we get into the detail of the schemes. Next slide, please. Delivery structures and how to deploy decentralized energy. Rihanna's touched on a number of points in the contractual structure and things to consider. Up front, we when we're establishing the once we've established the strategic intent of the landowner and the project sponsor, it's usually a very frank discussion about what we want to see come out of the project. and what are the key material points to the stakeholders. So it's generally, the funders behind the project and the landowner, if they're two different entities. Do we need to own the infrastructure on an ongoing basis? Is that material or not? Is there an appetite for ongoing operational elements, and goes on to the second point as well, post PC involvement. So once the scheme is built, what is the appetite of the landowner to remain involved in the project, and to what extent they'd like to take on operational elements of that. That could be anything from the operation maintenance of the infrastructure, metering, billing, customer service, any one of the above. They could be involved in facilities maintenance activities on the scheme already, doing the balance of FM on the site, and maybe they're happy to take on the customer facing element of it. And it's good to flesh out where you want to sit in the ongoing operation of the scheme. I think it's really valuable to look at, is this a one-off scheme, or is there a potential for a portfolio or aggregation of schemes with the same landowner or project sponsor? This really feeds into the financial structuring as well, because it does help with establishing financing. If you can look to aggregate or create a portfolio, and generally what we want to see there is consistency of contract structure, consistency of technology or heat source, and consistency of it could be a geographic vicinity, or just a general idea that you can group a number of projects together to create a portfolio, and that would attract different types of financing. What we've seen going out to market for various clients as well is selecting the provider and creating the supply chain. So going out to market and procuring operators to fulfill any of the elements you want to back or offset to third parties. We're seeing the operator and service provider market starting to develop and refine. We're starting to see operators and service providers starting to specialize in certain niche areas. There are schemes that they will or will not look at. There are certain operational elements they will or will not take on. So, 5 or 10 years ago, if you went out to market for an ESCO or service provider, you would easily attract six returns, 6 to 8 returns. Whilst there are more operators in the market today than there were 5 or 10 years ago, they are all starting to create their niche service, and you wouldn't expect, you wouldn't naturally expect six returns on a tender now as you would 5 or 10 years ago. So I think it's really key to understand, when we're establishing the strategic intent and the delivery structure, that there is a supply chain that can address the points that you need in the project. And is there an opportunity to partner up with these service providers? Is there an appetite for that? Is it purely a handoff service provision, or is it, is there an opportunity to create some sort of SPV or joint venture with the service provider? Next slide, please. So making it work for you, I have used this slide a number of times and over a number of years, and it's still as relevant today as it was many years ago. All of these assets really should not be looked at in isolation. Everything on your scheme, I would recommend that you look at in an integrated manner. You will have a variety of assets on your scheme as regulation and planning push us down a certain road. So we will naturally have things like PV, car charging, a heat network, a cooling network, or a PPA. I would suggest in the upfront, looking at it holistically, looking at all of the solutions in an integrated manner, and seeing if we can package those up. What are we looking to achieve in the costs or the project? Are we comfortable to take this on as a build cost, or are we looking to generate a revenue, an ongoing revenue from this? And this is what I touched on in the previous slide. It really goes hand in hand with your appetite to maintain some operational responsibility on an ongoing basis. Funding opportunities obviously has been touched on, and as I said, that it is true that funding is a difficult one, and you can seek project-specific funding. It's generally a bit more expensive, but there are public pots of money as well through the EU or the GLA as well. If you can achieve that aggregation of schemes where you have similar technologies and similar contract structures, you can start looking. If you can roll, a number of projects together, half a dozen or a dozen projects together, you can start attracting some patient capital, and there are opportunities to do that. But it does need some thinking ahead. Look over the fence is probably my favorite point of all of my presentations. It's incredible how often we miss opportunities just by literally just looking over the fence of your scheme, because so often we find there's opportunities for extending the scheme or connecting the scheme to third parties, and once you do that, it is true today as was 5 or 10 years ago that you increase the diversity and the heat load of your heat network. You will make it more efficient and commercially more attractive to all stakeholders, and it's a win for everyone. As long as you think about it, look at the options, make sure your contract structure supports it. It's definitely a win for everyone. And finally, it's where I started from the beginning. You get an early understanding of your obligations and what the opportunities are for the scheme. Make sure you've got your strategic intent and you understand what you want to achieve from the scheme and what you want to get out of it, what your appetite is for ongoing involvement. And once you've got that embedded, then you can start looking at ensuring your design and delivery strategies align with that. It's far too often we're looking at this too late. We're looking at it when we need to provide the first supply agreement to a customer, and we're already on the back foot. So I cannot stress it enough to please think about this when you're thinking about your 106 and potentially even before that. So next slide, please. I think that's it from me. So quick canter, Brianna.
Thanks ever so much, Vimal. That was really interesting, and thanks to Stephen too. So very quickly, just before we go to the panel discussion, I just wanted to run through a couple of things that are coming our way. We've spoken about a lot of them, and particularly decarbonisation and the Part L building regulations. I just wanted to flag, as Vimal said, on the building regulations, that for those developments that are going to take a long build out, they may already have their generation plant in place, and they're going to continue building over the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be very difficult to change and adapt to if you've got gas-fired CHP and looking to decarbonise that as the building regulations tighten between now and 2025. The heat and building strategy obviously was dropped just before COP26, which was good news for everybody, and it really underlines the government's drive towards making sure we have the most efficient buildings, the most comfortable buildings and heat systems that are cheap to run, or economical to run, I should say, and how networks sit within that. Wanting to phase out the gas boilers, looking towards heat pumps as a solution, but accepting that at the moment there's not a supply chain and the cost is a little bit too high. So how is government going to support addressing those two things? Heat zoning as well. There's just been a consultation on heat zoning, and this is really to address the fact that a heat network isn't going to be the best solution for every area, but we should really be identifying those that have a strong heat demand, or those that have a heat source, such as an energy from waste plant or industrial processing, which can provide a heat source. And making sure that by being strategic about where we put these heat networks, we can attract the investment in, and also to try and make sure we've got as much information as possible in the market to be able to attract those investors. Obviously, hydrogen is the big one in the room at the moment that we haven't touched on a lot here, but we will be touching on in the next seminar. Are we going to be moving off gas into a 100% hydrogen situation when we put hydrogen into the gas mains? The government's investing in trials at the moment and is going to make decisions apparently in 2026 around this. There are already, hydrogen ready boilers available in the market. If you wanted to buy them, there's not much point at the moment. The point is that there is development of technology and towards hydrogen as maybe a solution for heating in the future. And then the other one is regulation. Of course, as Stephen said, we are moving towards a regulated market where we're not at the moment. And so we may see less onus on putting those customer protections through long-term arrangements and big concession agreements that come to kind of 300 pages, because we will have a whole load of regulation to be able to rely on to protect customers and to make sure that we've got standards in place. I'm very quickly going to turn to some of the questions that we've had come in. There is one, Stephen, that I think you said that you may want to answer. This is about how local authorities require their housing schemes to connect to particular schemes run by a provider. How can they justify monopoly aspect when we look at rules around procurement and subsidy control? Is that one you wanted to pick up?
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting question, actually, because I think for very good reasons, a lot of local planning authorities are requiring new developments, in particular to have heat networks for decarbonisation reasons. But I think it touches on the whole issue about the fact that heat networks are not currently regulated in terms of consumer protection, and therefore, one could be requiring a new, if you like, a new development to include something which is going to leave its consumers vulnerable. Well, I think I suppose that the long-term answer to that is regulation. In the short term, what I would say is try and build in as much conditionality to that requirement, so that it's not a simple requirement, but that it's a requirement that that heat network does have to be built to proper technical standards. It has to have consumer protection in place via heat trust registration, and that potentially even that there's some kind of pricing structure in place. Now that's a big ask, but I think, and to some extent, it's a short-term issue, because within a few years, regulation will come in and protect consumers in these situations. But at the moment, it is a real concern, I think, that consumers are, if you like, being put into buildings with monopoly heat providers and no protection.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as well, that this is something that the Competition and Markets Authority looked at a number of years ago. And they created a study, a consultation, if you like, around heat networks. And the practical issue is that the way that they're set up, they will be natural monopolies, because it's not the electricity grid where you can just switch in and out and have a switch supplier. And it's not like the gas networks either. So from an infrastructure point of view, they are natural monopolies at the moment until we connect them all up all over the country. But the point is, their concerns were around customer protection. And that's why we have these long contracts in place, and we spend a long time negotiating them to make sure that the customer protection in place. And this touches on another point that's been raised up in the question and answers around pricing and controlling pricing. I think we've touched on it as we've gone along, Stephen, but as you've said, you've got the heat control comparator or heat price comparator as part of the heat trust tools in your armory at the moment. I don't know if you want to very quickly touch on that.
Yeah, so at the moment, all we can do is provide some transparency. But as I think I touched on earlier, when Ofgem become the the regulator, they will have price regulation powers. And I think that the problem is there are so many different models of how heat networks are set up and to what extent the capital costs have to be recovered via the charges, in some cases, in some cases not, whether the developer is trying to get a profit out of it as well. And of course, the cost of the heat source, which varies dramatically depending on whether it's gas CHP or electric heat pumps or waste heat and so on. So trying to find one pricing model that is reasonable for everybody in all cases is quite difficult. And of course, if you are running a very small heat network, say you're a building operator and you're simply running a communal heating system for that building and selling it to the residents, you're probably you're going to be purchasing gas potentially for running communal boilers or even the CHP system, and that gas price will have gone up quite dramatically in recent months, and you're not protected as a kind of commercial purchaser of gas like that by the consumer gas cap, price cap. So potentially you could have seen very big increases, and in some cases those will be passed on to consumers. So yeah, I think pricing is a real issue, and it's one in which Ofgem are going to have to find a way to regulate effectively to protect consumers without stifling the industry and preventing it from reasonably recovering its costs.
Thanks, Stephen.
Rihanna, just one other point to consider on that is obviously the local authority schemes. Generally, it's either a private scheme that has established itself within that local authority, or it's a local authority driven scheme itself. And I think in both instances, I think it's always good. Well, there's nothing preventing a developer of a housing scheme in that area to market test those prices and to establish for themselves if they feel it's a good value or not for their scheme.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of time. So one question really stood out to me, which I've never really thought about before. So it'd be really interesting if either the two of you have got any views on it. And that was that CHPs cost more to run in the summer when heat is not required. Now, not being a technical expert, I don't know the answer to that. I presume it's all around kind of designing your heat load and your off takers to make sure that you have a heat requirement at all times of the year. Maybe that's kind of making sure you've got commercial as well as residential, etc. I know that swimming pools are quite often used as a good source of heat because they've got to be kept warm all the time. But further than that, Vimal, it's an interesting one. I suppose lots of ESCOs help smooth that curve off by making sure that an element of their charging, the standing charges, are always payable rather than having the variable element, which is only payable and you'll pay more during winter because you use more heat. And I suppose your higher your standing charges, the better you'll help smooth that curve.
I think the starting point is, as you said, the technical design of it, making sure it's sized correctly for the scheme and running as a base load. We're not trying to achieve too much in the summer, and there's various ways of buffering that and storing energy to smooth the curve, and then you can further look to smooth the impact on the customer, exactly as you said. But I think it really does start with just designing and sizing your heat technology or the generating items appropriately, taking a realistic view on what the heat demands will be, rather than certain design factors, because what we are seeing, there is a delta between design and operation. So we need to make sure we can design to real world demands, and if we're doing that, then we're on the right foot.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we've reached 11 o'clock. So I know that everyone is very busy, especially in the run up to Christmas, and I wouldn't want to keep you any longer. So I want to say a huge thank you to Vimal and Stephen for your fantastic contributions today. I hope everyone's found it useful. We haven't managed to get to all of the questions today, but if you want to drop an email to me, I've got my details there that you can get hold of me. And also we will be sending details of part 2 around decarbonisation and hopefully our site visit to the very glamorous CityGen plant in Smithfield in London. So thank you ever so much to everybody who's joined, and we'll see you in March.
And again, if anyone's got any questions on consumer protection issues, please do get in touch.